Do you think that the United Kingdom, if you like, taking a step back, is that something that is something the United Kingdom in particular has done, or is it a wider trend that you've seen across other sort of P5 countries and other sort of senior members of the UN?
Well, I think the relative positions of leading countries in the United Nations does change over time. I like to think there are three factors that affect our influence in the world and at the United Nations. The first is the performance of our economy. The more effectively our economy is growing, the stronger the UK, that plays very well and very effectively into our foreign policy influence. I think the second is the leadership shown by our Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary of the day. That is really effective if it's done very well indeed. They have authority, they can play a leadership role. And I think thirdly is the investment we make in the tools of having an impact on the world. Our diplomatic service, our aid budget, our armed forces, our intelligence services. In the last few years, aid and intelligence have both been funded quite well and effectively. Certainly can't criticise on that score. Diplomacy and the armed forces is a different picture, and that is undoubtedly making it more difficult to carry weight in the world when those budgets are being held steady or cut back.
Yeah, I would, if I might, agree firmly with that, but I would add two other factors, and I'm sorry if I drag the dreaded issue of Brexit into this, but the two other factors that count a lot, particularly on the Security Council, are our relationship with the United States and our degree of influence in Washington, and our relationship and our position as one of the two European permanent members of the Security Council, and the degree to which we can, with France, help to shape European Union policy at the Security Council. There's always at least one more, and sometimes even two more, European Union members on the Council. Well, it just goes without saying, I'm afraid, that since June of last year, those two pillars of our influence at the UN have been shaken. In the General Assembly, we did have difficult moments from time to time, but we tended to avoid any very critical votes against us by the combination of European Union solidarity on the one hand, Commonwealth links and so on the other, and I don't remember any very serious setbacks in that period in the General Assembly, which is much more volatile and much less easy to predict and control.
So, I mean, you can see the reason I'm pressing this line of questioning, which is to say that despite the burdens of the time, you were able to handle the diplomatic pressures through a series of networks and alliances that existed and that seemed not to come into play this year on the Chagos Islands.
Yes, I think there are some straws in the wind, of which the Chagos Islanders instance is one, and the other, which I imagine we're coming on to at the Court of Justice, is another one, which show which way the wind is blowing, in my estimation, and I don't think it's going to stop blowing in that direction anytime soon, and I think it does demonstrate that our ability to fend for ourselves in a much more exposed position that we are in now is not as great as perhaps we would wish it to be.
May I push you to Sir Simon's, the current POS's, words that this was not the worst reverse you could sketch for this country or the country's diplomacy? I mean, while we agree this is not a defeat in war or indeed a major reversal in that sense, it is, as you say, it appears, as you say, to be an indicator of a troubling future.
I think it is a straw in the wind, that's what, as I would put it, which I think probably demonstrates that I don't think it was the end of civilization as we know it, but it is not a happy precedent, and we ought to sit up and take notice.
We've talked about the Chagos Islands, and you mentioned the ICJ. How significant is it that the UK is not represented on the ICJ for the first time in its history?
Well, I think you have to distinguish in answering that question whether it in some way invalidates in our eyes or in anyone else's eyes, the operation of the ICJ, and I would say very firmly that it does not. That the ICJ has an important role to play in the international spectrum, and that I believe it will continue to play it, even also in my view, lamentable situation that we are in of not having a judge at the ICJ.
There's an internal review being conducted by the Foreign Office at the moment. Is it usual to have an internal review into these kind of votes? Why would they do that? Are they trying to... They're downplaying the significance in public, but they're doing something, they're scrabbling around in private for the reasons that Britain lost?
I think after every event, success and failure, you should do a lessons learned exercise. That's something I learned very strongly in MI6, that when you had an operation, you always drew some lessons from it, whether it succeeded or failed. So I think it's right that the Foreign Office should look at at what lay behind this defeat at the UN. There weren't many defeats. There are occasional low-level bodies that we failed to get onto, but this was a very prominent defeat, and it's right that they should be looking into it. I'm sure there were reports to the committee in due course if you ask them.
The Minister, Sir Alan Duncan, told this committee that the UK's influence at the UN wasn't shrinking as a result of this vote. But it seems to me that in the answer to that question and some others, you're saying that UK's influence is shrinking, diminishing at the UN.
I don't think it's shrinking as a result of this vote. I haven't seen Alan Duncan's words, so I don't know exactly what he said.
He said exactly, we are not shrinking, we are not diminishing, in response to both questions about the ICG and the Chagos Islands.
Right. Well, the ministers, of course, have to defend a government position. I would say that our position at the UN was under some question and some challenge, not in an existential way, but it's the authority and the standing and respect that you have which enables you, as permanent representative, to garner sufficient votes in tight elections. I remember a very tight election in my time for the Human Rights Council, when 3 European countries were up for 2 seats. I think it was 2008, and the outcome was 123 for France, 120 for Britain, and 119 for Spain. And we snuck through by the skin of our teeth. Those elections are won or lost on very fine margins. I think it's important that we should we should aspire to have the authority to win those sorts of elections consistently. And I think we are going through a difficult period. There's no doubt about it that Brexit has raised questions. People I speak to around the world are very surprised and in some ways disappointed that the UK has taken this line. I know there are different views, and we know both on the committee, in Parliament, and in the country. But it did come as a shock and a surprise to many people around the world, and they wondered why Britain was taking this course, because it didn't seem to be one which was about engagement and influence in the world.
I do think, if I may say so, on your question, that it's not, with all respect to Sir Alan Duncan, it's not for the UK and its own government to say how it is regarded at the United Nations. It's how other people regard us at the United Nations. That's what counts. And I'm afraid in that respect, there will be people who perhaps don't bear our interests with the same degree and give them the same value as we give them ourselves, who will regard that like a shark would regard blood in the water.
Can I ask how important you sort of touched on Brexit earlier, and I'd like to sort of ask a bit more about that. How important do you think regional groupings are when it comes to achieving your aims in the General Assembly? And can you say a bit more about how you think our influence will be affected by Brexit?
Well, I think there are a number of different facets to that. First of all, there is the issue of European Union solidarity, which tends to work pretty powerfully at the United Nations, and which we will no longer have access to when we have left. And that will be a diminution in our tools of influence There's no doubt whatsoever about that in my view. And we saw it over the Chagos Island, where European Union members voted in the way they did or abstained in circumstances where I suspect before our vote last year they wouldn't have done. I can't be sure of that, but I think they would not have done. We could have the same phenomenon if and when the Falklands comes before the United Nations at some stage or another in future, where European solidarity, starting from the Argentine invasion in 1982, when, to the huge surprise of the Argentinians, the European Union imposed economic sanctions on Argentina in that circumstance. They would never have done that if we had not been a member. I don't believe for 1 minute they would have done that if we had not been a member. So the European solidarity issue is, I'm afraid, now in play, and I think we will lose it. How much that loss will matter? Well, I suppose a lot will depend on the relationship that we develop with the European Union and the degree of intimacy which our cooperation then has after we have left, and whether that involves also very close working relationships at the United Nations. But I don't believe that that will substitute for the automatic solidarity which has been at our disposal for the past 44 years. There are other areas of solidarity which work less well, but they do exist. And then, of course, there's the very important US relationship, which matters a lot because the US have a massive lobbying machine all around the world, which they have in the past often been very useful at mobilizing. And if an American, I mean, you can put it as bluntly as this, there is, I think, no capital in the world where if the American ambassador asks to see the head of government, they don't get in about 10 minutes. That cannot be said of the British ambassador.
If we're going to look forward in a sort of positive sense, post-Brexit, how would you recommend we change our behaviour at the UN to make us more effective? Are there some recommendations that you can make? So this is what we should do.
Yeah, well, I think you ask a question which goes much wider than our role at the UN, because our role at the UN is a reflection of our standing and authority in the world, which, as I was saying earlier, goes back to the questions of, first of all, how admired are we as a global power, how strong is our economy, how effective are our national leaders, and how much investment are we putting into the tools of influence in the world, our diplomacy, our aid, our armed forces and our intelligence services. So I think there are some fundamental questions that will need to be asked, and I think it would be important that when we come to the end of this Brexit process, that we can, first of all, reassess what the damage is to our national economy. There's no doubt that there will be some damage as we go through this process. We're already seeing it. How do we recover that position internationally in terms of our own economic policies? And how do we recover our standing in the world, which is undoubtedly taking a bit of a hit as we go through the Brexit negotiations? Now, that will require, I think, quite a wide-ranging review as to what this country's priorities in the world are. Are they about defending our security at home, or are they about shaping and influencing events around the world? And I would have strong views on that, and I'd be strongly in favour of the latter. I think our security at home depends on our influence and our role in the world. So I think there is going to be a major prioritisation exercise for the government, which should begin fairly soon, I think, because we can see the trend of the coming years, and we will need to recover from that. We don't want to go through a repeat of the 1970s, when this country was progressively going downhill compared to our international partners. We need to turn it around. I don't quite see how we're going to do it, but that's for politicians and for our national leaders to determine.
I just wanted to come back to something you said, Sir John. We've been taking evidence for about 56 minutes, and I'm yet to hear anything positive from you about how we can project ourselves post-Brexit. You've mentioned that you've spoken to people around the world and they've all been doom and gloom. You've talked about us being isolated. You've talked about our reduced powers. I am struggling to understand how you cannot see any advantages of us post-Brexit, considering the values that we have, the size of our economy, even though you stated earlier on that it was going down the pan, but considering we have 1,000 jobs a day being created, that's great. I was thinking if I was watching this at home, there's nothing but doom and gloom. And my concern is that how do we change your perception and other people that are in the diplomatic services and civil servants who have to take on this new task about being bold for Britain and doing all those things that you've talked about that should have been done for 18 months, where possibly Foreign Office staff and even ministers may have relied on other European partners to do it. But now we need to start fighting for places that we want. So I wonder, Sir John, if you had anything to say about the fact that we'll be leaving the EU in March 2019.
Well, Ms. Ghani, first of all, you seriously misquoted me on a number of points. You alleged that I said things which I didn't actually say. So let's just start again on the basis of you're asking me what are the positives that we can take away from Brexit. Well, the first thing we have to acknowledge is that Brexit is damaging our economy at the moment. Immediately after Brexit, we suffered a 15% devaluation of our currency. We devalued all the assets in the United Kingdom by 15%. We're going through a Brexit inflation at the moment, which means that people's pay rises aren't enough to keep up their real terms incomes. And we're, having been 18 months ago at the top of the G7 table of GDP growth performance, we're now at the bottom of that table, just 18 months later. So we're undoubtedly going through a bit of a dive. What I said is at the end of this process, we will need to work out how to rebuild our economy and rebuild our standing in the world. Now, a lot of weight has been put on our capacity to conduct our own bilateral trade negotiations. We'll see how successful that works out.